Call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I find myself agreeing with a lot of the detailed objections that the ACT member David Seymour had to the detail of this bill. The Labor Party, on balance, is voting for the legislation because it does think that there is a social ill that needs pushback of the law against I see Dr Russell Norman was smiling at my exposition of our position, but this is the position we've reached, that there is a social ill that needs to be addressed, which is the inappropriate use of the internet to bully people and to make their lives misery, that this new technology needs a pushback from Parliament to enforce a societal norm that disapproves of that sort of behaviour. And on balance, because there is this need to push back against what's happening, we're voting for the legislation. But the reason that we backed David Seymour's proposed amendment at the committee stage was that the legislation is, in our opinion, too broad and would be better were it narrower. And so I readily agree with David Seymour that this legislation is imperfect and could have been made better by this House. Now, what were our main three problems? And indeed, I asked the Minister to respond to these issues in the committee stage, and the Minister declined to do so, which I think is lamentable, because I thought the issues that were being raised by David Seymour and the Labor Party as well were correct. The problems fall into two main categories, or three main categories actually. First of all, you should always be wary where the government is applying a band-aid for a subset of problems for a particular technology, in this case digital communications, rather than to all communications. And this bill applies only to harmful digital communications, and therefore does things in respect of digital communications that aren't being done in respect of non-digital communications. It's an unusual thing to do, to legislate in a way that constrains rights of expression only for one mode of expression. And you would think if it was right to do that for one mode of expression, it would be right to do it for all modes of expression. And the fact that it's not across all modes of expression, you should ask yourself why. And the answer is because if the government was to make these proposals in respect of all modes of expression, there would be a public uprising as to the limits of freedom of speech and whether we've got that balance right. In respect of this legislation, Mr Speaker, there is no express preservation of the right of the media, for example. There is no express reference to rights of freedom of expression under the Bill of Rights, and given that this legislation is passed after the Bill of Rights and is more specific than the general provisions of the Bill of Rights, it's likely that the provisions in this legislation where there is inconsistency with the Bill of Rights are going to be interpreted in a way which will constrain rights of free expression. This could have been done in a way that is better than that and removes that ambiguity. And the way it could have been done would have been to for example, criminalise what is obviously and clearly wrong, which is what they've done in the United Kingdom, where they've criminalised what's called revenge porn, where if someone has taken in a personal relationship situation something that is an intimate photograph, then that should not be able to be put out there digitally to widespread utilisation after the relationship breaks down. That's essentially what revenge porn does. It takes what was done in personal confines, perhaps unwisely, but at a moment in a relationship, and then it's used for a purpose that wasn't contemplated at the time. It's not a misrepresentation. It's actually an image that is accurate, but it's being used for a wrong purpose. And so in the United Kingdom, they've criminalised that. And I can understand why, and I think the criminal provision in this should have been narrow like that rather than broadly defined as it is, because it covers such a wide ambit of communications in an ill-defined way that it goes further than it needs to do. So that's the first point, is that the criminal penalty here will amount to an infringement of free speech without being clear as to the limit on the limit. and I think it's poor legislation from that perspective. The second issue, sir, is the safe harbours that we voted for. I asked the question of the Minister at Select Committee whether we were in fact creating safe harbours that don't exist for internet providers or for intermediaries for these means of communication to the people who make money out of it, where they don't currently have a safe harbour. Now, and my concern was, and the example I gave was, if you were a provider of some internet communication forum that was attached to something that you made money from, you were trying to attract business to your website that you make money from. In order to do that, you ran a allied service to people which was a communication forum. Then currently you might face risks if you were publishing something that was defamatory. It seems that the safe harbour that we are creating here will be conferring protections on the organisation, that is the intermediary, that are greater than their current protections. So we might be undermining the current law, which would place that provider at risk if they didn't immediately respond to a complaint that something was defamatory and immediately take it down. And I'm not sure that that's good law, because we could be making things worse rather than making things better by creating a safe harbour where there may be none now. Now, I haven't been able to get my head around that fully, because the Minister's refusal to engage with that issue in the chair meant that I don't know whether that's correct or not. Well, it's a speech against this part of the bill, Dr. Norman. So this legislation, this legislation, sir, for those reasons, is not nearly as good as it could have been, because those sorts of concerns could have been dealt with if the Minister had been willing to listen, if the Minister had been willing to vote for some of the amendments that had been brought forward by the Labour Party and also by David Seymour on behalf of the ACT Party. Now, will it work? And that's the other question that we need to ask. Well, I suspect that it won't work completely, but that it will have some effect to heighten the stakes for inappropriate behaviour by some of those people who are currently deliberately promulgating harmful digital communications to the detriment of other people in society. So it will have some effect, but it also creates complexity in respect of our communication laws generally that could have been avoided through a more targeted piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, lastly, before I sit down, I just want to again say, in respect of the definitions about what amounts to serious emotional harm, it's very hard to tell because it's not defined, and I think that's undesirable as well. Mr. Speaker, with those reservations, which are substantial and could have been avoided had the government been more willing to listen to critics of its own legislation, the Labour Party supports this bill.
I call Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and speak in the House as the last speaker in the third reading of this harmful digital communications bill. The bill's in the name of my colleague, the Honourable Amy Adams, but of course it was originally introduced by her predecessor, the Honourable Judith Collins, in the last Parliament. And, sir, in the last Parliament I had the privilege to be chairing the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, where the bill was first sent.
Almost as well as her predecessor.
And almost as well as my predecessor, Tim McIndoe says, notwithstanding that he was indeed my predecessor. So, Mr. Speaker, I had an opportunity as the bill was introduced to the Select Committee to hear the submissions and to take an active participatory role in the Select Committee process up until the end of the last Parliament. And, sir, this was always going to be